Dakota Territory, January 12, 1887. The blizzard arrived without warning. By dawn, 4 feet of snow had buried the valley. Temperatures plunged to 15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and wind gusts reached 40 miles per hour. Most homesteaders faced a desperate choice: climb onto collapsing roofs to shovel snow or watch their shelters buckle under the weight. Caleb Warren stood at his cabin door, watching neighbors scramble across dangerous, sagging timbers. His own roof stood clear. Not a single rafter had shifted. The shingles were visible beneath a thin layer of powder. The difference was a 1-inch wooden kicker he had installed the previous summer, a shallow lip at the eaves designed to control snow shedding before accumulation could threaten the structure. What his neighbors had called wasteful carpentry through the warm months had become the line between shelter and disaster. By mid-morning, while others rebuilt, Caleb's cabin stood quietly intact. The frost covered every surface inside the cabin. Ice crystals clung to the rafters, gleaming faintly in the weak light from the hearth. Outside, wind hammered the log walls in steady, rhythmic gusts. Caleb Warren crouched near the stone fireplace, adding split pine to coals that offered more smoke than warmth. The calendar read January 7th, 1887. 7,000 feet above sea level in southwestern Dakota Territory, winter had already proven harsher than the previous 3 seasons combined. By the first week of the new year, snow depths across the region measured between 2 and 3 feet on level ground. Drifts against cabin walls pushed past 6 feet. Temperatures had not risen above 10 degrees Fahrenheit in 11 days. Caleb's homestead sat in a shallow valley 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. He had filed his claim in 1884, built his cabin in 1886, and survived his first full winter in this structure. He was 31 years old, unmarried, and supporting himself through a combination of trapping, seasonal labor, and the modest crops he could coax from high-altitude soil during the short growing season. Most settlers in the territory had expected a mild winter. The previous 3 years had brought reasonable snowfall and temperatures that rarely dropped below 0. Supply wagons had continued running through February. Livestock had survived on stored hay without excessive loss. The pattern suggested that winters at this elevation, while challenging, were manageable with standard preparations. By the end of December 1886, those expectations had collapsed. A series of early storms dumped snow faster than it could melt. The first significant accumulation arrived on December 5th, 18 inches overnight. Another storm on December 15th added 2 feet. A third on December 22nd brought 30 inches in less than 24 hours, accompanied by winds that drove snow into every gap and crack in frontier construction. Homestead records from the period document the consequences. A settler's diary entry from December 28, 1886, noted, "Roof gave way early this morning. 3 feet of snow piled during the night. Timbers cracked before dawn. Move family to Johnson's until repairs possible." Multiple cabins across the region suffered similar failures. Roofs built quickly during the settlement rush of 1885 and 1886 had not been designed for sustained heavy snow loads. Most featured steep pitches, 6:12 or 8:12 ratios, intended to shed water efficiently during spring rains. The steepness worked against them in heavy snow conditions. Snow accumulated in thick, compacted layers rather than sliding free. Weight transferred directly to rafters spaced too widely to support the load. Caleb's cabin had survived the December storms without damage, but he knew the worst of winter remained ahead. Frontier wisdom held that January and February brought the coldest temperatures and the most persistent snow. If December had tested structures, the coming months would determine which designs had been built correctly and which had merely been built quickly. The cabin measured 16 feet by 20 feet, larger than the minimum required by homestead law, which specified 10 feet by 12 feet. Caleb had spent the entire summer of 1886 on construction, working alone with hand tools and locally sourced materials. Other homesteaders completed similar structures in 3 to 5 days with help from neighbors. They had questioned why Caleb invested so much time in a building that served only as winter shelter. The answer lay in the roof design, specifically in a feature Caleb had incorporated after studying snow behavior during his first year in the territory. He had observed how snow accumulated on cabin roofs, how it compacted under its own weight, and how failures occurred when that weight exceeded what the supporting timbers could bear. He had also noticed that snow sometimes shed naturally from steep surfaces, but only under specific conditions. Temperature, wind, and the texture of the roofing material all influenced whether snow would slide or remain in place. From these observations, Caleb developed a modification to standard roof construction. He installed a shallow wooden kicker, essentially a raised lip, at the eaves of his roof. The kicker measured 1 inch in height and ran the full length of both long sides of the cabin. It was positioned approximately 12 to 18 inches up from the edge of the roof. The principle was straightforward. As snow accumulated on the roof, the kicker would interrupt the initial layers, creating a slight disruption in the snow's ability to bond with the roofing surface. When enough weight built up, the snow would overcome the small barrier and begin sliding. The kicker ensured that shedding happened gradually and predictably, rather than in sudden, dangerous avalanches that could bury doorways or injure anyone working near the cabin walls. Caleb had fabricated the kicker from 1 inch by 3 inch pine boards, beveling the edges with a hand plane to reduce friction. The total material cost was negligible, perhaps 50 cents for the additional lumber and a few extra nails. The labor investment was more significant. Shaping, fitting, and installing the kickers required approximately 2 full days of careful work after the main roof structure was complete. His neighbors had called it unnecessary, a waste of good lumber. Overthinking a simple problem, roofs either held or they didn't, and adding a small wooden strip wouldn't change structural capacity. What mattered was rafter thickness, spacing, and the pitch of the roof itself. Caleb had not argued. He simply finished his cabin according to his own design and prepared for winter. Now, as January advanced and snow continued falling, his roof remained clear while others around the region struggled with accumulation and the constant threat of collapse. The distinction between adequate construction and correct construction was about to become measurably clear. Summer 1886. Caleb stood on the ridgeline of his partially completed cabin, marking center lines for rafter placement. The valley stretched below him, grasslands turning golden under July sun. No snow, no wind, no immediate threat. This was the season for building, when frost-free ground allowed foundation work and when timber could be cut, hauled, and shaped without the complications of frozen wood and numb hands. Most homesteaders rushing to meet claim requirements built during this window with a singular focus: complete a structure large enough to satisfy the land office before winter arrived. Speed dictated design choices. Simple saddle-notch corners went up faster than more complex joinery. Single-thickness walls saved labor. Minimal window openings reduced carpentry time. A basic pole roof with bark covering could be assembled in a day. Caleb took a different approach. He had spent the spring of 1886 working for wages at a sawmill 60 miles east, saving money specifically for cabin materials. When he returned to his claim in June, he carried $20 in cash and a clear construction plan developed through the previous winter's observations. He began by cutting timber. Most settlers used whatever trees grew nearest to their building sites. Caleb walked the creek bottoms and hillsides within 2 miles of his chosen location, selecting specific trees based on diameter, straightness, and wood quality. He wanted logs at least 12 inches thick for the main walls. He needed straight-grained pine for rafters that would resist warping. He required fir for shingles that would weather well over multiple seasons. Each log was stripped of bark immediately after felling. Bark retained moisture, attracted insects, and created uneven surfaces that complicated chinking. Removing it required hours of work with a draw knife, A two-handled blade pulled toward the user to shave away outer layers. Caleb processed each log completely before moving it to the building site. He let the log season for 3 weeks, stacked with spacers to allow air circulation. Green wood contained significant moisture that would be released as the timber dried. A log cut in June might lose 8 to 10% of its diameter by September. If built into a structure while still green, that shrinkage would open gaps between courses, compromise chinking, and create structural weakness. Seasoned logs moved less after installation. The foundation work began in late July. Caleb dug a shallow trench around the cabin's perimeter and filled it with stones gathered from the creek bed. The stone base raised the first course of logs above ground level, preventing direct contact with soil moisture that would accelerate rot. It also provided a level surface that made subsequent courses easier to align. For the walls, Caleb used carefully fitted logs with hewn flat surfaces at the contact points between courses. He shaped these surfaces with a broad axe, creating consistent contact that minimized gaps. At the corners, he cut dovetail notches, more time-consuming than simple saddle notches, but significantly stronger. Dovetail joints locked together mechanically, preventing logs from separating under stress. Between each course, he applied chinking, a mixture of clay, sand, and fine grass. The clay provided the primary seal. The sand added structure and reduced cracking. The grass fibers reinforced the mixture, acting like primitive rebar to hold the mass together as it dried. Caleb mixed batches carefully, testing consistency until he achieved a compound that was plastic enough to pack into gaps, but firm enough to stay in place as it cured. The walls rose slowly. By mid-August, 7 courses were in place, bringing the structure to approximately 7 feet in height, taller than the minimum required, but not extravagantly so. The extra height provided better interior volume for heat retention and allowed for a proper sleeping loft if needed in future years. Then came the roof structure. This was where Caleb's design diverged most significantly from standard practice. He cut rafters from straight pine logs, hewn flat on the top surface, to provide a consistent plane for shingle installation. The rafters measured approximately 6 inches by 8 inches in cross-section, substantially heavier than the 4 by 6 dimensions common in quick-built cabins. He spaced the rafters 24 inches apart, measured center to center. Closer spacing than the 36-inch intervals many homesteaders used, but essential for supporting heavy snow loads. Each rafter was notched where it rested on the top wall logs, creating a mechanical connection that prevented sliding. He also installed diagonal bracing, additional timbers connecting each rafter to the ridge beam and to the wall plates, forming triangular reinforcement that distributed loads more effectively. The roof pitch measured 6 to 12, a rise of 6 inches for every 12 inches of horizontal distance. Steep enough to shed water, but not so steep that snow would avalanche unpredictably. This moderate pitch was deliberate. Caleb had observed that very steep roofs sometimes dropped snow in sudden slabs that could bury doorways or damage anything stored near the cabin walls. Over the rafters, he installed pine shingles, each one hand-split from straight-grained blocks. The shingles overlapped in the traditional pattern, with each course covering the gaps in the course below. He secured them with hand-forged nails, expensive at 5 cents per hundred, but far more reliable than wooden pegs that could work loose as the wood aged. The final step was installing the snow lip kicker. Caleb measured carefully, positioning the 1-inch lip at a consistent height, approximately 15 inches from the eaves. He beveled the upper edge to reduce friction and attached the kicker with nails driven through into the shingle layer below. A neighbor who visited in late August examined the completed roof and shook his head. "You've got enough timber up there for 2 cabins. All that time for a little wooden strip? Storm comes. Either your rafters hold or they don't. That lip won't change anything." Caleb didn't debate the point. He simply noted in his personal ledger, dated August 30th, 1886, cabin materials complete. Pine rafters, 30 pieces at 25 cents each. Shingles, 400 at 5 cents per hundred. Nails and hardware, $13.50 total. Snow lip materials, additional 50 cents. Total construction time, 11 weeks working alone. The ledger entry made no claim about performance. It simply documented what had been built and what it had cost. The testing would come later, when conditions arrived that would prove which assumptions about roof design had been correct and which had been dangerously optimistic. December 1886. The first major storm arrived on December 5th, earlier than expected, heavier than the previous 3 years had suggested, was typical. Caleb woke before dawn to the sound of wind driving snow against the cabin's north wall. By the time weak morning light filtered through the single window, 6 inches had already accumulated. The snow continued through the day and into the following night. By the morning of December 6th, Caleb's measuring stake showed 18 inches of new accumulation on level ground. Drifts against the cabin's windward side reached past 3 feet. Temperature had dropped from 25 degrees Fahrenheit the previous afternoon to 8 degrees by sunrise. This was not unusual weather for high-altitude Dakota Territory. What made it notable was the timing. The first significant snow typically arrived in mid to late December, giving homesteaders additional weeks to complete preparations. The early storm compressed the timeline, catching some settlers with incomplete wood supplies or unfinished repairs to doors and windows. Caleb went outside to inspect his roof. Snow covered the shingles in a relatively even layer, perhaps 16 inches thick, where wind hadn't affected distribution. The kicker was barely visible, a slight raised line beneath the white surface. He could see no evidence of shedding yet. The snow was fresh, light, and cold. Under these conditions, it would not slide. The crystals locked together with minimal bonding force, but the temperature was too low to create the slight surface melt that would reduce friction and allow movement. He returned inside and recorded the observation in his storm log. December 6, 1886. 18 inches, snow overnight. Temperature 8 degrees. Wind from northwest at approximately 25 miles per hour. Roof holding with no visible strain. Snow not yet shedding. Too cold and light. 3 days later, a brief warming period arrived. Temperature rose to 32 degrees Fahrenheit for approximately 6 hours during midday on December 9th. Caleb heard the first signs of snow movement, a soft sliding sound, then a muted thump as accumulated snow dropped from the eaves to the ground below. He went outside and observed that approximately half the snow on the southern exposure had shed, leaving the shingles partially visible. The northern exposure retained most of its load, protected from direct sun that might have initiated melting. The kicker had functioned as designed. The slight warming created a thin melt layer at the interface between snow and shingles. The raised lip interrupted that layer, creating a boundary where the lower snow mass could separate from the upper layers. As weight built up beyond the kicker, the snow overcame the small barrier and began sliding gradually downward, not in a sudden avalanche, but in a controlled flow that deposited the snow several feet from the cabin walls. Caleb measured the shed snow where it had piled near the foundation. Depth measured approximately 20 inches, slightly compressed from the original accumulation, but still representing the full thickness of what had been on the roof. He made another log entry. December 9th. Temperature rose to 32 degrees midday. Southern roof shed approximately half snow load. Kicker functioned correctly. Snow released gradually without avalanche. No strain on rafters observed. The pattern repeated through December. A storm would deposit snow. Cold temperatures would hold it in place for several days. A brief warming period or direct sunlight would initiate shedding. The kicker controlled the process. ensuring that releases happened predictably and safely. Other homesteaders dealt with roof snow differently. The most common approach was climbing up with a shovel and manually clearing accumulation before weight became dangerous. This required identifying the point at which snow depth threatened structural integrity, a judgment that many settlers lacked experience to make accurately. Clear too early and labor was wasted. Wait too long and rafters might fail before shoveling could be completed. Manual clearing also presented direct physical danger. Roofs were sloped, often covered with frost or ice, and became increasingly unstable as snow depth increased. A man working 8 feet above frozen ground, balancing on uncertain footing, faced real risk of falling. Several injuries occurred each winter from roof work, broken bones, sprains, occasionally more serious trauma. Caleb's design eliminated this hazard. He never climbed on his roof during winter. The kicker managed snow automatically, responding to natural cycles of accumulation and warming without requiring human intervention. His neighbors, watching smoke rise from his chimney while they wrestled with shovels on their own roofs, began to reconsider their earlier criticism. On December 15th, the second major storm arrived. This one brought 2 feet of snow in 36 hours, accompanied by sustained winds above 30 miles per hour. The combination created significant drifting. Snow depths varied wildly across short distances, 18 inches on swept prairie, 8 feet in protected hollows and against vertical surfaces. Caleb's cabin roof accumulated approximately 24 inches before the storm cleared. The pitch and the relatively exposed location prevented excessive drifting on the roof surface itself. When the sun emerged on December 17th and temperatures briefly rose above freezing, the accumulated snow began its controlled slide past the kicker. By evening, the southern exposure was nearly clear. The northern side retained partial coverage, but showed signs of movement that would complete shedding during the next warming cycle. A documented account from another homesteader, recorded in a diary entry dated December 18, 1886, provides context. Storm of the 15th buried us proper. Had to dig out the door. Roof held, but just barely. Spent yesterday clearing snow before rafters gave way. Back pains fierce today. Saw smoke from Warren's place. His roof clear already. Maybe he wasn't foolish after all with that extra work last summer. The December storms established a pattern that would continue through the winter. Snow would fall, accumulate to depths that strained conventional roof structures, then either require manual clearing or trigger structural failures in cabins built without adequate engineering. Caleb's roof performed its designed function repeatedly, maintaining shelter integrity without labor input and without the constant anxiety that accompanied uncertain structural margins. By December 20th, Caleb's storm log recorded 5 significant snowfalls, totaling 76 inches of accumulation. His roof had shed automatically during warming cycles. His rafters showed no signs of stress. He had spent 0 hours on roof clearing. His neighbors collectively had invested dozens of hours on the same task, with several experiencing rafter cracks or partial failures that required emergency repairs during brutal cold. The kicker, 1 inch of carefully shaped pine, had proven its worth. But the winter was not finished. The worst storms still lay ahead. December 22, 1886. The third major storm began with unusual meteorological signs. The morning air carried a peculiar stillness. No wind, temperature holding steady near 20 degrees Fahrenheit, clouds building from the northwest with a density that obscured distant ridgelines. Old-timers in the territory recognized the pattern. Significant weather was approaching. By noon, the first flakes appeared, large, heavy crystals that fell straight down in the windless air. Accumulation began immediately, building at a rate Caleb estimated near 1 inch per hour. He brought extra firewood inside, filled water containers, and secured the door and window shutters. The storm would be substantial. It continued through the afternoon, evening, and all night. Wind arrived after dark, not the sustained gale of earlier storms, but powerful gusts that drove snow horizontally across the prairie. Visibility dropped to arm's length. The temperature fell to 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Inside the cabin, Caleb maintained the fire and listened to wind test every gap in the chinking, every joint in the doorframe, every weakness in the construction. By morning of December 23rd, the storm had not diminished. Snow continued falling. Wind continued gusting. Caleb's measuring stake, visible through brief breaks in the blowing snow, showed depth approaching 30 inches on level ground. Drifts against the cabin's north wall had built past the window ledge. The storm cleared late on December the 23rd. Total accumulation measured 30 inches of new snow on top of existing pack. Combined depth on level ground now exceeded 4 feet. Drifts measured 8 to 12 feet in protected areas. Temperature remained 15 degrees below 0. Caleb did not immediately inspect his roof. Darkness and extreme cold made such work dangerous. He waited for dawn on December 24th. When he emerged from the cabin, the scene was transformed. The valley had become a uniform white landscape, all familiar landmarks buried or reshaped by wind-driven snow patterns. His roof carried the full 30-inch load, plus whatever had remained from previous storms. The pitch prevented excessive piling, but total depth likely approached 3 feet of compacted snow. The rafters bore this weight without visible deflection. The careful spacing, 24 inches center to center, distributed the load effectively. Each rafter supported approximately 150 pounds of snow over its span, well within the capacity of 6 by 8 pine timbers properly braced. Other cabins had not fared as well. Through gaps in blowing snow, Caleb could see a structure approximately half a mile distant showing signs of roof failure. The ridgeline sagged visibly. One end of the roof had dropped, creating an asymmetric profile that indicated rafter breakage or wall collapse. Smoke no longer rose from that cabin's chimney. The occupants had likely abandoned the structure or were sheltering in a remaining intact section. The pattern repeated across the region. Homestead records from the period document multiple failures during the December 22nd storm. A territorial newspaper published in early January 1887 included a summary. Reports from outlying districts indicate numerous cabin failures during the December storms. Roofs inadequately framed for snow loads collapsed under accumulations exceeding 2 feet. Several families were forced to seek shelter with neighbors. Structural losses estimated at 15 to 20 cabins within surveyed area. Caleb's cabin stood firm. The roof had performed exactly as designed. The snow load, while substantial, remained within the safety margins he had built into the rafter sizing and spacing. The kicker had not yet shed this load. Temperatures were too cold to initiate sliding, but it would function during the next warming cycle. That cycle arrived on December 27th, when temperatures rose to 28 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours. Direct sunlight struck the southern roof exposure, creating the thermal conditions necessary for shedding. Caleb heard the familiar sliding sound around midday, a sustained rumbling as 3 feet of compacted snow released from the kicker line and dropped to the ground below. The northern exposure followed partially the next day, with complete clearing occurring by December 30th during another brief warm spell. The mechanics of this shedding deserve examination. The kicker did not support the snow's weight. That task fell to the rafters and shingles. Instead, the kicker created a controlled failure point. As the bottom layer of snow began to melt slightly, the raised lip prevented that meltwater from bonding the lower snow firmly to the shingle surface. When gravitational force exceeded the friction between snow and roof, the entire mass slid past the kicker in a controlled release. Without the kicker, snow might still shed eventually, but the timing and manner would be unpredictable. Sometimes large sections would release suddenly. Other times, snow would remain bonded to the roof through multiple freeze-thaw cycles, adding dangerous weight. The kicker standardized the process, creating reproducible behavior that a homesteader could anticipate and plan around. The material cost of this innovation remained minimal. Caleb's ledger documented 50 cents for the additional pine boards used to fabricate the kickers. Labor investment, 2 full days of measuring, cutting, beveling, and installing, represented the primary expense. For a homesteader working alone, 2 days in August represented perhaps $4 of equivalent wage labor. Against this modest investment, the benefits accumulated through the winter season. 0 hours spent on dangerous roof clearing, 0 rafters requiring emergency repair, 0 nights spent uncertain whether the structure would survive until morning. The peace of mind alone justified the effort, but the practical advantages were measurable in time, safety, and structural longevity. A neighboring homesteader visited on December 31st. He examined Caleb's clear roof and the pile of shed snow near the foundation. Then he looked at his own cabin, visible across the valley, where snow still burdened the roof and where he had spent hours with a shovel 2 days earlier. His comment recorded in his own diary that evening: "Visited Warren today. His roof clear, mine still loaded. Asked about his edge boards. Simple enough. Maybe I can add them come spring. Would save my back and my worry." This observation represented the beginning of knowledge transfer. A practical innovation, once proven effective through documented performance, began spreading through the local community. The mechanism was informal, a conversation, an inspection, a decision to replicate what had worked elsewhere. No formal plans existed, no blueprints or instruction manuals, just the visible evidence of success and the willingness of the innovator to share his methods. By New Year's Day, 1887, Caleb's cabin had survived 3 major storms totaling 76 inches of snowfall. His roof had shed automatically during warm cycles. His structure remained sound. The winter's worst challenges still lay ahead, but the design had proven itself under conditions that had damaged or destroyed multiple conventional structures. The kicker had done its work. The question now was whether the pattern would hold through January and February, when the coldest temperatures and the most persistent snow typically arrived. January 3, 1887. Caleb examined the broken rafter brought by his neighbor William Moss, whose cabin had partially failed during the December 22nd storm. The timber measured approximately 4 inches by 6 inches in cross-section, standard dimensions for quick frontier construction. The break occurred at mid-span, where bending stress concentrated under distributed snow load. The fracture pattern told a clear story. The wood had split along the grain, starting from the bottom surface where tensile stress was greatest. Small cracks had propagated upward through the timber until the remaining cross-section could no longer support the load. The final failure had been sudden, a sharp crack in the night, followed by the sagging collapse of one entire roof section. Moss had evacuated his family immediately, moving them to a neighbor's cabin 3 miles east. He returned the following day to salvage what he could and assess repair requirements. The damage was extensive. 3 rafters had failed completely. 2 others showed dangerous cracks. The entire roof structure would need to be rebuilt before the cabin could be safely occupied again. He had come to Caleb seeking advice. "Your rafters, what size did you use?" Caleb led him outside and pointed to the visible rafter ends where they extended beyond the wall plates. 6 inches by 8 inches, spaced 2 feet apart, measured center to center. Moss shook his head. "Mine are 4 by 6, spaced 3 feet. Seemed adequate when I built last spring. Saw plenty of cabins with the same." "Adequate for rain," Caleb said. "Not adequate for 3 feet of wet snow." The mathematics were straightforward, though few homesteaders had the training to calculate them precisely. Snow weight varied depending on moisture content and compaction, but a reasonable estimate for the wet, heavy snow common in December storms was 12 to 15 pounds per cubic foot. A roof section measuring 3 feet by 12 feet covered 36 square feet of surface area. At 30 inches of snow depth, that section carried approximately 900 pounds of weight. A 4 by 6 rafter spanning 12 feet and supporting 3 feet of tributary width carried roughly 900 pounds at midspan. The bending stress in the timber approached the failure threshold for standard pine, particularly if the wood contained knots, grain irregularities, or moisture that reduced strength below ideal values. Caleb's 6 by 8 rafters, spaced closer together, distributed the same total roof load across more support members. Each rafter carried less weight, and the larger cross-section provided greater resistance to bending. The safety margin was substantial, enough to handle the actual loads experienced during the December storms with minimal stress. Moss studied the construction details silently. Finally he said, "I built fast, wanted the cabin done before snow came. You built slow. Which of us was smarter?" "You had a cabin in 3 days," Caleb replied. "I had a cabin in 11 weeks. If this had been a mild winter, you would have been right, and I would have wasted effort." "But it wasn't a mild winter." "No, it wasn't." Moss departed with measurements and a rough sketch of Caleb's rafter system. He would rebuild using heavier timbers and closer spacing. The additional material cost would exceed his original construction budget, but the alternative, another winter of uncertain shelter, was unacceptable. This conversation represented a pattern that repeated across the territory through January. Homesteaders who had experienced failures or near failures during December sought information from those whose structures had performed well. Knowledge transferred through direct observation and practical consultation. No formal institutions facilitated this process. No government agricultural extension agents, no engineering societies, no published building codes. Just neighbors helping neighbors survive. January 12, 1887. The temperature at dawn measured 18 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Wind from the northwest gusted to 30 miles per hour. The combination created wind chill conditions approaching 40 degrees below 0, cold enough to cause frostbite on exposed skin within minutes. Caleb remained inside, maintaining the fire and conserving movement to reduce caloric expenditure. His food stores were adequate: dried meat, flour, beans, and root vegetables, stored in a below-ground cellar where temperatures held steady near 40 degrees. Water came from melted snow. Firewood remained stacked against the cabin's south wall, protected from drifting by the structure itself. Outside, the prairie was locked in deep freeze. Snow from December storms had settled and compacted under its own weight, creating a hard crust strong enough to support a man's weight in many areas. New snow from early January storms added another 18 inches of loose powder atop the crust. Total depth measured 5 feet on level ground, with drifts reaching 12 to 15 feet in protected areas. Under these conditions, snow would not shed from roofs. Temperature needed to rise above 28 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours to initiate the surface melting necessary for sliding. The extended cold snap, which had persisted since January 1st without temperatures rising above 10 degrees, meant that any snow accumulated during this period would remain in place until a warming cycle arrived. Caleb's roof carried approximately 40 inches of total snow load. The December accumulation had never fully shed from the northern exposure before new January snow arrived. The combined weight pressed against the rafters continuously. The timbers flexed slightly under load, a normal response in wood structural members, but remained well within safe limits. Other cabins were less secure. A homesteader living 2 miles south had climbed onto his roof on January 10th to shovel accumulated snow. The temperature that day was 8 degrees below 0. He spent 90 minutes working with numb hands, clearing approximately 1/3 of his roof before exhaustion and cold forced him to retreat inside. His diary entry from that evening: "Cleared what I could. Back aches. Fingers won't bend right. More snow coming tomorrow. Don't know if I can do this again. The labor demands of manual roof clearing were significant. Snow at these temperatures was dry and relatively light, perhaps 8 pounds per cubic foot, but volume created weight. A homesteader clearing a roof measuring 12 feet by 16 feet covered 192 square feet of surface area. At 40 inches of snow depth, total volume approached 213 cubic feet, weighing approximately 1,700 pounds. Moving that mass with a shovel, one scoop at a time, while balancing on an icy slope in a dangerous cold, represented exhausting and hazardous work. Caleb's kicker eliminated this labor entirely. The snow remained on his roof, but he knew it would shed automatically during the next warming period. He could wait safely inside, conserving energy and avoiding the risks associated with winter roof work. The temperature log for January showed the pattern clearly. Sustained cold from January 1st through January 11th, with daily highs never exceeding 5 degrees Fahrenheit and lows reaching 25 degrees below zero on January 9th. Then, on January 12th, a shift began. January 12th, 1887 continued. By mid-afternoon, the sky darkened. Wind shifted from northwest to northeast. Temperature began falling from the morning's 18 below zero toward even colder readings. Caleb recognized the meteorological pattern, a major storm system approaching. The blizzard arrived at dusk. Snow began falling heavily, driven by winds that built rapidly from 15 miles per hour to 40 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to zero. The cabin shuddered under wind pressure. Snow found every crack and gap in the construction, infiltrating past chinking and around door frames as fine powder that accumulated on interior surfaces. This was the storm that would define the winter of 1886 to 1887. It continued through the night of January 12th, all day January 13th, and into the night of January 14th. Total duration exceeded 40 hours. When it finally cleared on the morning of January 15th, the landscape had been transformed. Caleb's snow gauge, a marked stake driven into level ground 30 feet from the cabin, showed total accumulation of 48 inches of new snow. Combined with the 5 feet already on the ground, total depth now exceeded 9 feet on level ground. Drifts against the cabin's north wall had buried the structure to the eave line. The door was blocked completely, requiring Caleb to dig a tunnel through 6 feet of packed snow to reach open air. Temperature on the morning of January 15th measured 20 degrees below zero. Wind had diminished to 10 miles per hour. The sky was clear, with the brittle blue color characteristic of extreme cold and dry air. Caleb's roof carried a snow load exceeding 5 feet in total depth. The weight was enormous, likely approaching 3,000 pounds, distributed across the entire roof surface. His rafters bore this load without visible deflection. The 6x8 timbers, properly spaced and braced, handled the stress within their design capacity. Across the territory, this storm destroyed structures that had survived December. The documented accounts from the period are numerous. A territorial government report compiled in March 1887 noted, "The Yamad, January 12th, blizzard resulted in catastrophic structural failures across western districts. Estimated 40 to 50 cabins suffered complete or partial roof collapse. Multiple fatalities attributed to exposure following loss of shelter. Economic losses from livestock mortality and property damage exceed $50,000 in surveyed townships." A specific diary entry from a homesteader 20 miles north of Caleb's location provides detail. January 15th. Storm cleared this morning. Our roof failed during the night. Heard timbers crack around 2 o'clock. Everyone evacuated to the root cellar. By dawn, entire north section had collapsed. Snow filled half the cabin interior. Gathered what we could carry and walked to Johnson's. Don't know when we can return. Caleb's cabin remained intact. The roof design, the careful material selection, the investment of time during construction, all these factors combined to create a structure capable of surviving conditions that destroyed faster, cheaper alternatives. But the snow load remained. 5 feet of accumulation pressed against the rafters continuously. The kicker was buried completely beneath the mass. Shedding would not occur until temperatures rose enough to initiate melting, and the forecast, based on Caleb's observation of weather patterns, suggested that sustained cold would persist for at least another week. The cabin would need to bear this weight until nature provided the conditions necessary for relief. January 22, 1887. The cold persisted. 10 consecutive days since the blizzard had passed, and temperature had not risen above 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Daily lows reached 30 degrees below zero on January 18th and January 20th. Wind chill conditions made outdoor work impossible, except for brief essential tasks: feeding livestock, gathering firewood, checking for structural damage. Caleb's food stores were diminishing measurably. He had entered winter with approximately 80 pounds of flour, 30 pounds of dried beans, 20 pounds of salt pork, and assorted root vegetables. His consumption rate ran roughly 1 pound of flour, half a pound of beans, and a quarter pound of meat per day, supplemented by occasional fresh game when conditions allowed hunting. By late January, supplies had dropped to approximately 40 pounds of flour, 15 pounds of beans, and 8 pounds of meat. The mathematics of frontier survival were unforgiving. A man required roughly 2,500 calories daily to maintain body weight during winter, with additional calories needed for physical labor in cold conditions. Flour provided approximately 1,600 calories per pound. Beans offered 1,500 calories per pound. Salt pork exceeded 4,000 calories per pound due to its fat content. Caleb's remaining supplies represented approximately 60 days of adequate nutrition if consumption continued at current rates. Winter typically extended through February and into early March at this elevation. Roughly 45 days remained. The margin was thin but sufficient, assuming no catastrophic loss of stores and no extended inability to hunt or trap supplemental protein. Other homesteaders were less secure. The January 15th blizzard had damaged or destroyed food stores in collapsed cabins. Families who evacuated to neighbors' homes brought little beyond what they could carry. The burden on those providing shelter increased dramatically. More mouths to feed from supplies calculated for smaller households. A documented account from a homesteader sheltering 3 displaced families in addition to his own describes the situation. January 24th, 14 people under one roof now. Flour running low, cut rations to half normal portions. Children crying from hunger. Don't know what we'll do if this cold doesn't break and supply wagons can't get through. Supply wagons from larger settlements typically made rounds every 3 to 4 weeks during winter, bringing staple goods, mail, and news. The January cold snap had halted all freight movement. Roads were impassable, drifted to depths exceeding 10 feet in many locations. Temperatures made travel dangerous even where routes remained clear. The last wagon had arrived on December 20th. The next would not appear until conditions moderated. Caleb rationed carefully, reducing daily flour consumption to 3/4 of a pound and supplementing with increased bean portions. He set snares for rabbits and other small game near the cabin, checking them during brief windows when wind died and temperature rose marginally above 20 degrees below zero. Success was inconsistent. Some days brought fresh meat, others nothing. The weight of snow on his roof remained constant. No shedding occurred in the sustained cold. The rafters continued bearing the load without visible stress, but Caleb monitored carefully for any signs of creeping deflection that might indicate progressive failure. He measured the interior ceiling height at multiple points, comparing to marks he had made during construction. No change was detectable. The structure remained sound. Outside, the snow depth slowly compacted under its own weight, settling from the loose 9 feet immediately after the storm to approximately 8 feet by late January. The reduction in volume did not significantly reduce weight. Compaction increased density, offsetting the decrease in depth. The roof load remained near 3,000 pounds. February 1st, 1887. The temperature at dawn measured 5 degrees above 0 Fahrenheit, the warmest reading in 21 consecutive days. Wind remained calm. Sun rose into a cloudless sky. The conditions suggested a brief warming period, potentially lasting several days if the weather pattern held. Caleb stepped outside and immediately noticed changes. The air felt different, less brittle, more static. Snow. Surfaces showed subtle signs of softening. The hard crust that had supported a man's weight for weeks showed slight give underfoot. These were indicators of approaching thermal conditions that would initiate roof snow shedding. By mid-morning, temperature had risen to 12 degrees above 0. Direct sunlight struck the south-facing roof surface, warming the shingles beneath the snow mass. Heat conducted into the bottom layer of snow, creating the thin melt layer necessary for sliding to begin. Caleb heard the first movement around 11 o'clock, a low rumbling sound, then a sustained sliding noise as the entire southern roof section's snow load released simultaneously. 5 feet of compacted snow, representing roughly 1,500 pounds of weight, slid past the kicker line and dropped to the ground 8 feet below. The impact created a muted thump and a cloud of powder that hung briefly in the still air before settling. He walked around to observe the deposit. The shed snow had piled near the foundation in a compressed mass approximately 6 feet high and 3 feet wide, extending the full 16-foot length of the cabin's south wall. The snow showed clear stratification, distinct layers marking different storm events, separated by thin ice lenses from brief warming periods. The roof itself was now clear of snow on the southern exposure. Shingles were visible, darkened by moisture but intact. The kicker had performed its designed function perfectly, controlling the release, ensuring that shedding happened when thermal conditions made it safe and predictable rather than in sudden, dangerous avalanches. The northern exposure retained most of its snow load. Shaded from direct sun, it would require additional warming or several days of above-freezing temperatures to initiate complete shedding. Caleb was not concerned. The load had been reduced by approximately 40%, bringing rafter stress well below the levels experienced during the previous 3 weeks. Across the valley, other cabins showed different patterns. Some had shed snow in uncontrolled slides, burying doorways and creating barriers that would require hours of shoveling to clear. Others retained full loads, their owners either unable to climb safely to clear snow manually or gambling that the rafters would hold until natural warming allowed shedding. One cabin, approximately 1 mile distant, showed visible roof sag. The ridgeline curved downward slightly at the center, a clear indicator of rafter deflection under sustained heavy load. The structure had not yet failed completely, but the deformation suggested that timbers were stressed beyond elastic limits. Permanent damage had likely occurred. Caleb recorded the event in his log. February 1st. Temperature rose to 12 degrees by midday. Southern roof shed complete snow load approximately 11 o'clock. Kicker functioned correctly, controlled release with no damage to structure or blockage of access. Northern. Load remains, but reduced total weight significantly. The warming period continued for 3 days. By February 3rd, temperature had reached 28 degrees Fahrenheit, the warmest reading since early December. The northern roof exposure completed shedding. Both slopes were now clear, the rafters released from weeks of continuous heavy loading. The relief was measurable not just in structural terms, but in psychological terms. The uncertainty that accompanied sustained heavy snow loads, the constant assessment of whether timbers would hold, whether one more storm would trigger failure, had eased. The cabin had survived the worst winter in regional memory without damage. February 10, 1887. William Moss returned to his rebuilt cabin. He had spent January completing repairs, working during brief warm spells to replace broken rafters and reinforce the entire roof structure. The new construction followed Caleb's specifications: 6 by 8 timbers spaced 2 feet apart, properly braced, built to handle snow loads that the original structure could not bear. He had also added snow lip kickers at the eaves. The installation required less than 1 day of work, using scrap pine left over from the rafter replacement. The kickers measured 1 inch in height, positioned 15 inches from the roof edge, with beveled top surfaces to reduce friction. Moss's diary entry from that evening provides documentation. Moved back into the cabin today. Roof feels solid now, nothing like the uncertainty of last year's hasty work. Added the edge boards that Warren uses. Simple enough design. Should have done it from the start. Would have saved 3 weeks of repair work and the cost of new timber. This pattern repeated across the region through February and into March. Homesteaders who had experienced failures or near failures during the January storms modified their structures during the brief windows when weather permitted construction work. The snow lip kicker, having demonstrated clear performance advantages, became a standard feature in these rebuilds and repairs. The transfer of technical knowledge followed informal channels. A homesteader would visit Caleb's cabin, observe the design, ask questions about dimensions and installation. Caleb shared information freely: measurements, material choices, the reasoning behind the kicker's position and profile. He had no financial interest in protecting the innovation. Frontier survival depended on mutual assistance and shared knowledge. By late February, at least 6 cabins within a 10-mile radius had incorporated kickers into their roof systems. Some were new construction by homesteaders replacing collapsed structures. Others were retrofits added to existing roofs that had survived but shown troubling signs of stress. The installations varied in detail. Some used 1-inch kickers like Caleb's, others experimented with different heights or profiles. But the underlying principle remained constant. A traveling merchant who made supply rounds to isolated homesteads documented the trend in his ledger. February 27th. Visited 11 cabins this week in Western District. 7 showed new roof edge boards. Homesteaders call them snow lips or kickers. Simple design, claimed to help snow slide before weight builds dangerous. Several credited the idea to a settler named Warren. Pattern suggests rapid adoption of effective innovation when survival stakes are clear. The economic impact was measurable. A homesteader who installed kickers eliminated the labor burden of manual roof clearing. At an estimated 4 hours per clearing event and 3 to 5 events per winter, the savings approached 12 to 20 hours of dangerous, exhausting work. Valued at standard labor rates of 25 cents per hour, the time savings alone exceeded the material cost of the kickers within a single season. The safety improvements were harder to quantify but equally significant. Eliminating the need for winter roof work removed a source of injury and occasional death. Falls from icy roofs, frostbite from prolonged exposure during clearing work, and the general physical toll of heavy labor in extreme cold. All these risks diminished when roofs shed automatically. The structural benefits extended beyond immediate survival. Roofs that shed snow regularly experienced less sustained loading, reducing stress cycles that caused progressive timber damage. The rafters, wall logs, and foundations all benefited from decreased cumulative strain. The expected service life of properly designed structures increased measurably compared to marginally built alternatives that suffered repeated heavy loading. By spring of 1887, the snow lip kicker had transitioned from a curiosity to an accepted element of frontier construction in the region. The innovation had proven itself through documented performance under extreme conditions. The knowledge had spread through practical demonstration and voluntary adoption. No regulatory mandate drove the change, only the observable fact that some roofs survived while others failed, and the difference was traceable to specific design choices. March 15, 1887. The winter was ending. Temperature had risen above freezing consistently for 5 consecutive days. Snow was melting rapidly, exposing ground that had been buried since early November. The transformation from locked winter landscape to muddy spring thaw occurred with the speed characteristic of high-altitude environments where seasonal transitions were compressed into narrow time windows. Caleb inspected his cabin thoroughly, checking for damage that might have occurred during the months of sustained heavy loading. The rafters showed no signs of stress fractures or permanent deflection. The wall logs remained properly aligned, with chinking intact at all courses. The foundation stones had not shifted. The structure had survived 4 months of brutal winter without measurable degradation. He compared his rafters to the broken timber William Moss had brought in January. The failed rafters showed clear stress patterns, grain separation along growth rings, compression damage on the upper surface, and the catastrophic tensile fracture on the lower surface that had triggered final failure. The timber had been undersized for the loads it carried and had failed predictably under excessive stress. Caleb's rafters bore no such damage. The material factor of safety built into his design, using 6x8 timbers where 4x6 might have been minimally adequate, had protected the structure throughout the extreme loading events of January and February. The additional cost of heavier timber and the extra labor of cutting and installing larger members had proven entirely justified. The winter of 1886 to 1887 entered regional records as one of the most severe on record. A territorial government summary compiled in April documented the statistics. Total snowfall for the period November 1st through March 15th measured approximately 234 inches across surveyed districts at elevations above 6,000 feet. Maximum single-event accumulation measured 48 inches during the January 12th to 14th blizzard. Minimum temperature recorded was 32 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit on January 20th. Structural failure rate among homestead cabins exceeded 30%, with highest losses among structures built during 1885 and 1886 settlement rushes. Caleb's cabin had weathered this winter without damage, without labor-intensive manual snow clearing, and without the constant anxiety that marked less secure shelters. The snow lip kicker had performed its designed function through repeated storm cycles. The heavy rafter sizing had provided adequate structural capacity. The careful construction had created a shelter capable of protecting its occupant through conditions that had destroyed or damaged dozens of surrounding structures. The contrast between adequate and correct construction had never been more clearly demonstrated. Cabins built quickly to minimum standards, with cost and speed prioritized over structural margin, had failed under extreme but predictable loads. Cabins built carefully with appropriate material sizing and thoughtful design features had survived. The difference was not luck or favorable location, it was engineering, even if the builders did not use that term to describe their work. April 1887, spring settlement resumed across Dakota Territory. New homesteaders arrived, drawn by land availability and agricultural potential. They filed claims, began construction, and prepared for their first frontier winter. Many sought advice from those who had survived the brutal 1886 to 1887 season. Caleb became a resource for these incoming settlers. His cabin served as a tangible demonstration of construction methods that worked under extreme conditions. He showed visitors the snow lip kicker, explained the rafter sizing and spacing, described the careful material selection and installation procedures. The conversations were practical and specific: measurements, costs, construction sequences, material sources. Several new cabins built during the spring and summer of 1887 incorporated kickers from initial construction rather than as retrofits. The design feature was becoming standard practice in the region, adopted not through regulation but through demonstrated performance and practical knowledge transfer. A carpenter arriving from eastern states to establish a commercial building operation documented the trend. May 20, 1887, surveyed construction practices in western Dakota settlements. Noted widespread use of roof edge boards installed to facilitate snow shedding. Local builders call them kickers or snow lips. Design originated with settler named Caleb Warren during previous year's construction. Feature now considered standard for high-elevation builds. Material cost negligible. Installation adds approximately 1 day to construction schedule. Performance during last winter's extreme conditions appears to justify adoption. The kicker's spread beyond the immediate region occurred through similar informal channels. Homesteaders who relocated, carpenters who traveled between settlements, and merchant networks that connected isolated communities all served as vectors for technical knowledge diffusion. By 1888, snow lip kickers appeared on cabin roofs across the northern plains, wherever snow load management was a significant concern. The innovation was never patented or commercialized. Caleb had no interest in claiming ownership of an idea derived from simple observation and logical application of basic principles. The design remained in the public domain, freely available to anyone who understood its value and wished to incorporate it into their own construction. Caleb Warren proved up his homestead claim in 1890, completing the required 5 years of residence and improvements. He eventually sold the property in 1903, moving to a lower elevation location where farming was more productive and winters less severe. The cabin stood for another 3 decades, occupied by subsequent homesteaders who benefited from its solid construction. By the 1930s, the structure had been abandoned. Weather and time took their toll. The roof eventually failed, not from snow load, but from decades of exposure that rotted the shingles and timbers. The walls settled as chinking deteriorated. By 1950, only the stone foundation remained visible, marking where the cabin had stood. The snow lip kicker survived as a design element in regional construction through the early 20th century. It appeared in agricultural extension publications and in the accumulated practical knowledge of rural carpenters. The feature gradually faded from use as improved building materials and engineered roof systems provided alternative solutions to snow load management. By mid-century, few builders remembered the innovation's origins or the winter that had proven its worth. Caleb Warren died in 1922 at age 66. No obituary mentioned his cabin or the small design modification that had helped him and others survive the winter of 1886 to 1887. He was remembered by family as a cautious man who prepared carefully and built things to last. The broader impact of his work, the knowledge shared, the structures that survived, the neighbors who adopted his methods, was never formally documented. What remains is the archaeological evidence. Foundation stones arranged in a precise 16 by 20 foot rectangle, marking where a cabin stood that exemplified the difference between adequate and excellent frontier construction. The site sits on private land, unmarked and largely forgotten, known only to local historians who study settlement patterns and building evolution. The lesson embedded in those stones is simple and enduring. Time invested in careful design and construction is never wasted when survival depends on structural integrity. A 1-inch wooden kicker, properly positioned and installed with attention to detail, saved hours of dangerous labor and provided peace of mind through months of brutal winter. The innovation required no advanced technology, no expensive materials, no specialized expertise, only observation, thought, and the willingness to build correctly rather than quickly. Caleb Warren's cabin stood firm when others fell because he understood that frontier survival rewarded preparation over haste, careful planning over expedient shortcuts, and thoughtful engineering over hopeful assumptions. The winter of 1886 to 1887 proved these principles with brutal clarity. Those who built right survived. Those who built fast often did not. The snow lip kicker was never revolutionary. It was simply correct, a small detail executed properly that made the difference between enduring shelter and catastrophic failure. In frontier environments where margins were thin and mistakes were fatal, such details determined who survived winter and who abandoned their claims. The foundation stones remain, quietly marking where one mountain man's careful observation and methodical execution created a shelter that outlasted the season. Everyone expected to be mild, and instead became the winter that sorted adequate construction from excellent construction. The roof that dumped 4 feet of snow overnight without splitting a beam stands as testament to the value of doing things right the first time, even when neighbors question the effort and the season seems far away. What choice would you have made on that day? Share your thoughts in the comments. Practical stories keep this history alive.